Welcome to the Robot Impurity Vintage Lens Review Series. Over the past few years, I've accumulated a bunch of manual focus or vintage lenses that I've adapted to my Canon cameras. I found these lenses from such locations as a local camera shop, namely Tucson's excellent Monument Camera, to pawn shops and antique malls, to online shopping such as Etsy or keh.com. One never quite knows what to expect from purchasing a used lens built decades ago, so I will be reviewing my collection of lenses one by one with real-world usage and photos. Our inaugural episode will be discussing the Axis P-MC 28mm wide auto macro f2.8 lens for the Canon FD mount. Unfortunately, I was not always great about remembering where I purchased some of my lenses or how much I paid for it, but I do believe it was somewhere in the $30 to $40 range and most likely at a secondhand shop of some sort. I have no intention of belaboring the technical specifications of this lens beyond the basics. It is a 28mm macro lens with an f-stop range from 2.8 to 22. My version is an FD mount, though I have read that Axis made lenses for the Pentax K mount as well. The lens can focus at a distance of 0.3 meters or slightly less than 1 foot. The macro ring allows users to select normal focus to 1 to 1.37. Granted, as someone who hasn't done a ton of macro photography, that number doesn't mean a whole lot to me. But in order to test this lens in a real-world setting, I chose some scenarios for real-world usage, including landscape shots on a hiking trail near Tucson and some urban wanderings in downtown Tucson. I have used this lens quite a bit for landscape photography in the past. 28mm is a very good focal length for general landscape photography. I mostly leave it in f8 and change the camera ISO as needed to get my exposures right. The sharpness at f8 is solid. My camera has both focus peaking and the ability to magnify the viewfinder image to check for sharpness while focusing. While this method is occasionally imprecise, partly due to the fact I have astigmatism and mostly fake my way through photography, it is useful enough to get excellent results. Obviously, if you're in Tucson, you'll want to take photos of the saguaro cactus doing wacky things. That is basically 83% of the appeal of living here. The other 35% is amazing Mexican food options, with the other 27% being the winter weather. But given that it's summer as the time of this recording, we'll ignore the weather. I took test photos on an early morning hike to avoid both the heat of the day as well as to get the obligatory morning lighting that all landscape photographers strive for. For the record, I am a staunch advocate that landscape photography should not be limited to golden hours and super specific lighting, but that's a rant for another time. I also set up my camera to capture both RAW and JPEG so we can do a side-by-side comparison of a few shots to see how the lens renders images in the camera without my mucking it up in post-processing. Most of the photos of a broad view field turned out quite nicely, with more than adequate sharpness for an old lens from a more obscure manufacturer. However, there'll be much more on this a bit later. My attempts to get close up and all macro were less than stellar. The lens does occasionally cause a vignetting, which is something I honestly don't mind much, as that is something that can be expected with some of the budget lenses. It also can result in interesting lens flare when aiming towards the sun. When used for video, it feels like it renders colors decently and provides a wide enough view to be interesting on the screen. Though, you can probably judge for yourself as well as judge my amateur videography skills. Wait, who's doing reviewing here? Wandering around downtown Tucson one morning showed both strengths and weaknesses of this lens. Let's just dive right into what I dislike about this lens, and it's a tad ironic. For a macro lens, it's not very good at macro photography, and especially attempting to shoot wide open at f2.8. This has some of the softest focus. Wait, actually, let me amend that. It's sticking hard to get a decent focus at 2.8. Multiple attempts at close-ups of flowers resulted in completely unusable images. This was while having the macro dial set at 1 to 1.37. I did have somewhat better results from f4 or 5.6, but still not spectacular. Plus, there is just a feeling a 28mm focal length is just too wide to be effective for macro photography. But like I said earlier, I don't do a ton of macro photography, so maybe I'm just fumble-fingered. And besides, I tend to shoot handheld most of the time, so we have to factor in my shakiness into matters. Tucson features an abundance of awesome murals. Even with the early morning light not being quite bright yet, I got plenty of shots of the excellent artwork. This lens does a great job when you're in f5.6 to 8 f-stop range and gets adequately sharp images. I say adequate because these older lenses are never going to be as tack sharp as some of the modern ones, but tack sharp is somewhat overrated. And if you're the type to pixel peep, you'll never be satisfied with these older lenses. The focal length might make this a decent street photography lens, though I'm not well versed in that style. But I will say that I took several shots with this lens that I'm very, very happy with. So, I did attempt to arrange a session with a local model, but unfortunately we were unable to connect in time for this video. Thus, I resorted to the cutest possible solution, a couple photos of my cats. They're not always the most cooperative of models, but they did sit still long enough for a couple snaps. What I noticed immediately is that when I have the macro dial set to 1 to 1.37, it is impossible to get a sharp focus, rendering that feature basically useless. In the normal setting, I was able to get a couple somewhat sharp photos, albeit soft around the edges. For some portrait or artsy situations, this might be fine. However, given a wider view in the frame, this isn't an ideal portrait lens, though it may be satisfactory for a subject being part of a larger landscape setting. The pros. Great at landscape photography due to the wide angle and general sharpness at f8. It is lightweight. It has a nice long throw in the focus ring, allowing for fine tuning to get the focus close to just right, assuming you're not doing it in macro. It is inexpensive. And the lens body feels really well constructed. For a macro lens, it doesn't do macro very well. Very soft focus when wide or open. I wouldn't use this often at 2.8 again, nor would I ever want to try it in many low light situations. I didn't bother with any night photography as the results would be dismal. The current pricing online for this lens is around $30 to $55 US dollars on eBay. If I had to buy it again, I might pay $30 to maybe $40 max. I will give this a rating of a solid B. While there are shortcomings as a macro lens, it has plenty of usefulness in other types of photography, and in fact, it's one I've taken with me for many landscape photography excursions. This is one I will recommend and continue using for myself for my own photography.